2, et cetera. So what we're looking for here are ratio. The question we're going to ask is this ratio greater than 1 in districts that are favored by the president? I'll talk about how we operationalize that. That's the question. Whereas if I'm in an opposition area, is my ratio less than 1? Am I getting less than the average? Okay, let me pause. Any questions on this measure or thoughts about how to interpret it? Yeah. Well, so you're raising an interesting question. How much of this is over-invoicing versus actual spending? We have two measures. I only put one up here. One is the spending that was sent. Now, there could be over-invoicing. So we also have kilometers of paved road actually built. So if we're afraid that maybe there's just different levels of corruption in different areas, we want to look both at what was spent and what was actually built, like what was built. And what we use for what was built is not what the government said was built. We used official international roadmaps where they go and they look at the quality of the road. Is this a proper paved road or not? So we're able to say not just what was spent, but what was actually built. And actually, the results are very similar. So the degree of over-invoicing in some areas versus others was not so extreme, such that tons was spent in some area, but nothing was built. When stuff was spent, things were basically built, for the most part. Or if there was over-invoicing, it happened everywhere, not just in some areas. Yeah. Yeah, okay. This is road spending in District D in year T. This is the total amount of millions of shillings spent, say, in roads. This is population in that district. And the reason we use 1962, so they became independent in 1963, but just before independence, the British did like a census in 1962. So we have like really good data for 1962. That's why we use 1962. And again, we were concerned there might have been some endogenous migration, so we focus on that year. Yeah. What sort of biases would you? Okay, so let me tell you more about what we run in terms of we're going to regress this. This is going to be our outcome. We're going to regress this on whether your district is dominated by the same ethnic group as the president. And when I talk about that measure a little bit more, let's come back to your question, see if anybody can think of why we think this is a well-interpreted regression or not. Yeah. That's a great question, and it's something that's debated a lot. We're revising this paper now. So in the paper you guys have, we look at expenditures per population. We also look at expenditures per land area. We look at both. You get kind of the same answer either way. In the revision of the paper right now, we're looking at not just population, but we're doing expenditures per economic activity in a district. So you might think, originally population, you need to build roads where there's a lot of commercial activity. And you get the same sorts of results there. So no matter what we've put in to scale the expenditure measures, we get kind of a similar result. But there's no one simple answer. I mean, in this paper, when we presented it to our colleagues, they're always saying, well, thinking like economists, what is optimal? What is the optimal road network? Like, what would be the best ideal road network? And there is no one answer to that. No one knows what the answer is to that. There are some experts on transportation, though, who have certain rules of thumb about economic activity, what's called market potential, et cetera. So we can use those instead, but it's a really good question. We don't have a perfect answer to that. Okay. So let me show you what the road network looked like over time. So 1964, right after independence, you can see there weren't very many paved roads in Kenya. There were some roads through Nairobi, kind of in a few directions out of Nairobi. So, near Nairobi, there were a bunch, there's a lot of population, so there were some roads there. And then there was a road into the highland areas where the white settlers were. They wanted to be able to get places. They paid good money for that land. They'd stolen it. So, they wanted to be able to drive in and out of their land. And then there was a little bit of a road sort of towards western, but, didn't quite get there. That little blotch of road, and let me circle it, over here, I believe is Kisumu. You just can't see the lake there. And then there's a little blotch of road around Mombasa. So those are the other two cities other than Nairobi, which is here. So there's basically a little bit of road around the three largest cities, and then roads from the capital into the plantations. That's pretty much all there was. That's what the colonialists had wanted. By 1969 already, we start seeing quite a bit of expansion in the road network. So the first thing that was done is a good road was built to Mombasa. There had already been a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa, but now a road was built, had some truck traffic, and a little bit of expansion in western Kenya, although not a ton. There was now a road from the highlands over to the border with Uganda to facilitate international trade. So there were a couple. There was a road to a port now and a road to the border. So those are kind of sensible roads that you would think would get built, but not a ton of additional road construction. Now, from 1969 now to the next maps, you'll start seeing a lot more construction. So from 1969 to 79, you see a ton of road construction, actually. And there's definitely some in those pink areas. There's a bunch in western, but there's really a lot near Nairobi. In those green areas, you can see just a lot of filling in of really dense roads in those kind of Kikuyu areas in central Kenya, and some in western. So there's a lot of road spending. Between 1979 and 1992, there was still some road building here, but not a ton. But there was a lot more out here in the pink areas, the Kalenjin areas. So the road network starts getting filled in, and then out to 2002, it just keeps expanding. So you all of a sudden start seeing roads sort of in all directions, even up to the north. You can see up to Turkana. Okay. Any other patterns visible to you guys, or anything interesting you see in the expansion of the road network? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a very arid area. It's a mainly ethnically Somali area. It's very dry. There's very few people that live there, and basically no roads were built. No roads were built there. It's pretty striking, right? It's like this empty part of the map. Yeah, exactly. It's going to line up pretty well. You'll see that like the roads followed where people were pretty closely. But that's right. That whole area is pretty much neglected. Yeah. A lot of the roads are used for shipping goods, for trucking. Very few people in this period, very few Kenyans have cars of their own. But there's a very extensive sort of public minibus system, public bus system, a lot of trucking companies. So they're actually used a lot. That said, until very recently, it was very rare in Kenya to have traffic jams. I mean, Nairobi would have been the only place where you really would have had congestion the way we would see it. One thing that's interesting is, good roads aren't only used by people with cars. People with motorcycles, it's a lot easier to use. People, even with bicycles, if I have to take grain 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers to a market, it's so much easier on a road than on a bumpy path. So even people without cars can benefit. But there is, a fair amount of use of these roads. And roads are very popular. People really want roads because they see there being all these benefits to roads. So roads, education, health, these are like very high-profile public investments in Kenya. Any other patterns that jump out? Yeah, Martin? We chose these years because remember how I mentioned that there were international mapping people that map roads everywhere? These were the years they mapped the roads. And in fact, there were a couple others I dropped, like in the 70s and 80s, just to have only 5 here. But basically, these are their official maps. You might be concerned that the Kenyan government, if they spent all this money on a road, would say the road was paved and in good quality even if it wasn't. So these are just like independent measures of road quality. Okay. So we've talked about ethnicity, we've talked about roads, so let's talk about democracy, and then we're going to put these three things together in about a sec. So democracy is this key issue. We've talked about how African governments were quite undemocratic in the 70s and 80s, but now are much more democratic than they were. That was something we talked about the first couple weeks. Kenya is no different. It's had periods of more democracy and less democracy, and actually it says that should be 63, sorry, December 63, so almost 64, they became independent. What you can see is, and I showed you this plot before, what you can see here is the blue line, which is Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa, the trend in terms of democratization looks a lot like Kenya, which is the red line. Higher values are more democratic, lower values are more sort of autocratic. And you can see over time that there was quite a bit of democracy in Africa and in Kenya in particular in the 60s, but basically a very sharp drop-off in the degree of democracy sort of in the late 60s. So what we do here is we use a classification from this so-called polity measure. It's one of the standard democracy measures, which is if you're less than -5 on a scale, it goes from -10 to 10. If you're less than -5, you're a very repressive autocratic state, basically. There's just no political competition. If you're greater than -5, you may not be a perfect democracy, but it means there's at least opposition parties, there's some free media, there's some political space for the opposition. So the period to the left there counts as democracy until about 1969 or 70, where Kenya goes below -5. So this is an autocratic period until about 1992, 1993, after which Kenya becomes democratic again. So there's kind of these like three periods: a democratic period right after independence, a couple decades of autocracy, and then a more democratic recent period. So that's what we're kind of looking at. Democracy kind of gets turned off and on again in Kenya. So the question we ask here is, how has this shift in political institutions affected the degree of ethnic bias? So for instance, when you have a democracy, you might think, well, democracies work well. As I mentioned before, maybe in democracy I need to cut deals with different ethnic groups. I can't be as biased in favor of my own group. I have to create coalitions and make compromises and do all that kind of stuff. So maybe in democracies you won't see as much ethnic bias. But maybe it goes the other way. Maybe in a democracy where political parties are organized along ethnic lines, you see the most blatant ethnic appeals, ethnic discrimination, and all the political competition. All that it does is bring out all these divisions in politics, making for more extreme ethnic bias. Did you have a comment? What these polity folks do is they have several different inputs into this index. For instance, are opposition parties legal or not legal? Okay, if they're legal, you get a certain number of points. Is there any independent radio? Is there any independent television? Yes, no, et cetera. And they kind of add up all these things and come up with this score. So basically, if you're below -5, there's one party rule and there's no independent media. And civil society is really squeezed. And that was basically Kenya for a couple decades. If you're above -5, you have at least some legal opposition, some legal private media. And the higher you are, the more of that you have. But that -5 is sometimes used as a cut point for below that. It's just a very repressive dictatorship. Evan? Okay, so this is interesting. I'm going to talk about this. Kenyatta dies here and is succeeded by Moi. And there was just a brief, slight opening where people thought Moi, the second president, I'll tell you all about these guys, was going to sort of liberalize the country. He's from a different ethnic group. He's ethnically Kalenjin. So at least in one way, it became more democratic, because under Kenyatta, there was a feeling that ethnic Kikuyus dominated the government from top to bottom. So Moi was starting to change that. In 1982, there was a coup led by Kikuyu Air Force officers to try to overthrow him, because they were like, hey, wait a minute, like, we run the government. This guy's trying to have other people sort of get positions of authority. But he put down the coup. And after the coup, basically kicked tons of Kikuyus out of his government and made it sort of an anti-Kikuyu regime in some ways. So that's where they kind of go back down in 1982 to where they were, and it remains quite repressive until the early 90s. So there was this episode of brief political violence at that point. Yeah. It does really well. I didn't put that figure up. It's in the paper. I just thought I was going to run out of time. If you just plot out growth, we talked about these three periods that are exactly like this. Growth in the 60s to early 70s, stagnation in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, and then this turnaround since then. And it turns out that the time pattern of democracy and growth are pretty closely aligned in Kenya and Africa during this period. So we can't say for sure if it's causal. It's definitely not a randomized experiment, but it's pretty interesting that those patterns line up. I think what everybody would ask is, was it the better economic performance that sort of allowed democracies to thrive? And then when sort of economies collapsed, democracy collapsed with it? Or did democracy lead to better governance and better policy and better growth? And people have made the case both ways. If you want to look at this turnaround in Africa, the turnaround in democracy occurred a little bit before the turnaround in growth. The turnaround in democracy happened sort of the early to mid-90s, and then the turnaround in growth starts in the late 90s. So that's consistent with maybe democracy helping the process along, but we wouldn't want to overstate it. But you're totally right to make that observation. There are these three periods politically and economically in Africa. Yeah. There's a Kikuyu president again after the election in 2002 and 3 here. And then there was another election just last year in 2013 that was won by Kenyatta's son, Uhuru Kenyatta, which we'll talk about. Okay. A lot of names. Most of you guys are like, oh God, he said like 17 names. I haven't even gotten into Oginga Odinga, Raila Odinga, and we can keep going. But hopefully you're kind of with me so far on some of this. And that's actually the perfect point for our first clicker question. I'd like to start up the clicker thing. Hold on a sec. Let's see if it shows up over there. Yeah. Okay. So, in your view, are more democratic institutions likely to weaken or exacerbate, make worse ethnic bias in Kenya? A, democratic institutions are going to weaken ethnic bias, meaning there's going to be less ethnic bias. Democratic institutions are going to make it worse, that's B. Democratic institutions probably won't have any impact, and I have no idea, which is a respectable choice, always. Although it's more fun to guess. Okay. This is pretty interesting. You guys are pretty split. Most people think democratic institutions will help, but a lot of people think actually it can make it worse, and then others think maybe it won't have much effect. Okay, so let's find out what the answer is. So before getting into exactly that question, I just want to say a few more words about leadership in Kenya and leadership transitions. When you think about road funding in Kenya or public goods in general, it's important to keep in mind that the president, the executive, has a lot of authority in Kenya. The constitution was designed that way. The kind of revisions to the constitution under President Kenyatta and President Moi strengthened the presidency. You can really think of the presidency as a sort of imperial presidency where the president has tremendous authority and its power is very centralized. So in the 1960s, when Jomo Kenyatta came to power, a lot of the other ethnic groups were really concerned about Kikuyu domination. The Kikuyus were the largest group, the richest African group. There were small ethnic minorities, South Asian minorities, Middle Eastern minorities that were also wealthy, but much smaller and very small politically. But among the African ethnic groups, the Kikuyus were sort of the wealthiest, best educated, the largest. They had the presidency, and there was a fear there'd be domination. So the other ethnic groups got together, led by a politician, Daniel Arap Moi, who became president, became the second president, as well as a leader from the Luo ethnic group, Oginga Odinga. And they, people love that name, and it's a great name, pushed for decentralization, meaning different regions should have more authority. It shouldn't all be centralized in Nairobi. And their point is, look, there's all these different ethnic groups, all these different regions. We should have more say about what happens in our region, but that was flatly rejected. And in fact, beyond just centralizing power in Nairobi, after the late 60s, when there was sort of rising opposition to Kenyatta, he banned opposition parties and made Kenya de facto a one-party state. And so not only was power centralized in Nairobi, it was centralized in this one party, called KANU, Kenya African National Union. Okay, that has changed a lot. So that kind of very centralized, very powerful presidency that was almost unchallenged in the 70s, 80s, started getting challenged in the 90s. There was a lot of popular pressure and popular uprisings that forced the country to democratize in the early 90s. Private media, opposition parties, civil society groups, protest marches, et cetera, that really started sort of limiting the power of the executive somewhat. The biggest change happens after our sample. So just a couple years ago, a new constitution was passed that implemented decentralization. That looks a lot like the decentralization proposed in the 1960s. So now those county governments get lots of their own budget. They elect their own officials. There didn't used to be elected local councils in Kenya. Everybody was appointed from Nairobi. So in the Kenyatta period and the Moi period, every local official was appointed from Nairobi down to the regions. Again, it's this very imperial model. And most of those leading officials in the Kenyatta period were Kikuyu, even in non-Kikuyu areas. So there was a feeling that this one dominant group was really in charge of the government. Now there's local elections, local councils. Anyway, after the period we studied though. But even before the new constitution, Kenya had changed a lot. And there was a lot more democratic activism. That means it was a little harder to just fund whatever you wanted to fund. Yeah. 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 A little bit of both. So there's more elected local officials from the counties of particular kind. So for instance, counties now have there was a real awareness of the underrepresentation of women in Kenyan politics. So counties elect a female representative to go to parliament from that county who's supposed to represent the interests of women, for instance. Now they're only a small share of parliament. There's hundreds of people in parliament, but that's a big change, and it means these county elections become very, very important. So that's one change. But there's a big change in funding. So just this morning I was on the phone with some of our colleagues in Busia because we're doing some work, not on roads, but on another infrastructure project, electrification. Traditionally, all that electrification funding was determined in Nairobi centrally, where someone in the president's office might literally pinpoint exactly where transformers would go up. Now there's a budget of money, say $1 million, that goes to a county that they can use to electrify whomever they want in their county. Or maybe they use it for something else. So, and road spending is similar. So all this big infrastructure spending is much more decentralized now. But again, that's after 2011, and we have data through 2011. So we're looking at sort of a 50-year period where everything was centralized. And it makes it easier to study in some sense, because we know basically the decisions were being made in Nairobi during that period. Radhika. I didn't put that up. In our appendix, we actually coded the ethnicity of all the cabinet ministers in Kenya during the period. And you do see there's always pretty decent representation of different groups, even under presidents from different ethnic groups. But presidents from particular ethnic groups favor their own group a lot. So the cabinet is disproportionately made of their own group in our data. But there's always some representation in the cabinet. So even in the sort of dictatorship period, there were some attempts to build coalitions across ethnic lines, even if they were limited, but not like what you see in democracy, is what we said. So let me just show you a little bit of the timeline, and I want to show you some of the results. So there's going to be 5 relevant periods for us. The first 2 are under President Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta. I talked about him last time. He was the first president. He ruled from 1963 to 1978. He was an ethnic Kikuyu. The first period of his rule was democratic. There were opposition parties. They were opposing his policies. They wanted to decentralize. It was active policy debate until he basically crushed them in 1969. It's kind of interesting, this links in a little bit to U.S. history just because President Obama's dad was from an ethnic group in Western Kenya, the Luo, that during this period, 1963 to 69, were leading the opposition to Kenyatta, or some of the opposition leaders like Oginga Odinga came from that ethnic group. But after 1969, there was this sort of crushing of the opposition and centralization of power under Kikuyu. So lots of sort of promising Luo officials, ethnically Luo officials, were sort of frozen out of good jobs. So the story that's often told about President Obama's dad is during that period, his sort of professional ambitions were dead. His political ambitions, his bureaucratic ambitions, he just couldn't sort of move up politically because he was from this opposition ethnic group. That's at least the story that's told. Okay, from 1970 to 1978, Kenya's an autocracy, according to the polity scale, dominated by a Kikuyu president. In 1978, Kenyatta dies of peaceful causes, nonviolent causes. He was old. And he's succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi, who had been in the opposition to Kenyatta in the 60s. But then after the opposition was crushed, he sort of cut a deal early on, and maybe even before the opposition was crushed. He was smart. He cut a deal with Kenyatta and became vice president of Kenya. And he was vice president for this whole period. So when Kenyatta dies, he became president just by the constitution. And as I mentioned, he started changing policy. There was an attempted coup by Kikuyu officers that he crushed. And then after that, he sort of solidifies, you could say, Kalenjin ethnic control over many parts of the army, the government, especially the army, because he had been threatened by Kikuyu officers. So from 1979 to 1992, it's still an autocracy. It's still one party. He rewrites the constitution until all this sort of democratic uprising started in 91, 92, 93, when Kenya was basically forced also by the international community to democratize. The US and the major lenders basically threatened to cut off all foreign aid to Kenya unless they legalized opposition parties in 1992. So there was also a kind of international role. And then Moi rules from 93 to 2002. He won 2 elections. The presidency has 5-year terms in Kenya. He won 2 elections, the 92 election and then the 97 election. Both were widely rigged. There was a lot of